Good evening, everyone. We continue our study in the book of Psalms. We're now in Psalm 105. We ended in verse 15 yesterday, and I just want to draw your attention back to verse 1. Verse 1 is to help us paint the picture that as they call upon God to give thanks, to shout out his name, uh, David, who wrote this psalm, talks about making his deeds known among the peoples. The peoples here really mean the people who are not of Israel. And you find that all these is a testimony that is to be provided not only for the Israelites, but for all the peoples, including those not of Israel, to know this God of Israel, what he has done. Now, in verse 2, it clearly tells us that it is talking about his wonders. Now, this word wonders, coming in this Hebrew word, is about pala. Pala is the awesome, uh, unexplainable events, things that is supernatural. And I just want to add one more point to this before we get back to verse 16, is that all of these are to be uttered out as it began. We said that the background was concerning the bringing of the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem. And so First Chronicles 16, 2 Samuel 6, and that would become the background to this psalm. Although it is not stated that David wrote the psalm, we see in First Chronicles 16 that David actually wrote the psalm for the choir master to actually sing, and these are all the Levites. But the point I wanted to remind all of us is that all these making known the supernatural events that God did is regarding a national level event, not David's personal experiences, but also the things that pertain to the history of the Hebrew people. And we spoke about what God had made as a cut, a berit with Abraham, and then reiterated to Isaac and confirmed it with Jacob. And it was all about the land that God was going to give to the Israelites, the Hebrew people, that David today can proclaim the kingdom of David. In verse 16, as we continue, we're talking about what God is doing or what God has done, the things that he has done in terms of miraculous signs, wonders, miracles, things that is to be told to all the peoples of all the lands. And he begins to relate as God made the promise of the land to Abraham, reiterated to Isaac, and confirmed it with Jacob that their descendants will come back. David is now recounting these stories that is taken from the book of Bereshit, which is Genesis. And it says here, and God, called for a famine upon the land, and he broke the whole staff of bread. Now, this idea he called for indicates that the initiator or the planner of what the English would call famine upon the land, and this will be not just the land of Canaan, but also the land all surrounding, including Egypt. And he broke the whole staff of bread. The whole staff of bread literally means the branch of bread. The tribe of bread, I guess it sounds a bit weird, but basically what it means is whatever is providing bread. And then it says here, God was the one who broke them or break into pieces. Now, these are all part of a song, and so we need to get hold of the picture. The picture is depicted that it was God who initiated all this, and so we see this as an A and a B. And the idea of famine has to do with bread. So let me explain. The idea of famine is the concept of the lack of bread. The word famine here comes from the word ra'af, famine. So let's deal with famine. We call it famine, but basically the word here is to be hungry or famished. And the reason is there is a lack of food. And by food, we talk about bread. And so when we talk about this idea of famine, it implies that there is a shortage of food. And it is I guess it's a shortage of what makes food. So think with me, and we shall get into this a little bit here. The way that they make bread comes from grains. And grain will be wheat, barley, even corn. And I think we should also understand in Genesis chapter 1, God gave fruits as food as well. And the whole idea here is when you can actually fill the stomach, that would be eating. And so you eat food, and food draws itself from the grain and from the fruit. And so famine implies that there is a time when people went hungry because there was a lack of bread. And so you look at the second statement here, he broke the whole staff of bread or the branch of bread where even when places where they had bread, they ran out of it. So bread and famine are interrelated. It is important for us then to remember if bread and hunger is interrelated, then famine would be the lack of grain and fruit. That would be the way to understand this. But more so, it is not just this. I draw your attention to, say, Genesis chapter 43, verse 11. Genesis chapter 43, verse 11. Let me just bring it out on this side of the screen. Now, right here, Genesis 43, verse 11 says this. Then their father Israel, which is the other name for Jacob, said to them, these would be the 11 sons that they are going to bring, including Benjamin, for the second time down into Egypt, and thereby meet Joseph, whom they are not aware it's still Joseph. And so Jacob consented. And so he said, if it must be so, then do this. Take some of the best produce of the land in your bags and carry down to the man as a gift. A little balsam, a little honey. And then it says, little of the spices. These are the spices. Then a little myrrh. Then you've got pistachios and almonds. These are all native nuts. Now, understand this. When we talked about food, we talked about grain and fruit. Nuts are not considered food. And so during this famine that they are supposed to be experiencing, they still have nuts, but they have to go down to Egypt to buy grain. And notice there is an absence of fruit here. Let me just point your attention to one more verse. That's in Ezekiel 36, verse 30. We have here Ezekiel 36, verse 30. We're trying to learn this word so that we don't have a misconception when God says famine. What does it really mean? In Ezekiel 36:30 says, instead, I will multiply the fruit of the tree and the produce of the field, so that you will not receive again the disgrace of famine among the nations. And so by this kind of a statement, famine really means a lack of fruit and a lack of produce of the field. And by produce of the field, as we had spoken, grain, wheat, barley, and corn. So famine literally means a lack of fruits and a lack of produce of the field. And so in verse 16, as we have seen, this is ascribed to God because this famine is very, very different. And so when we go back and read Genesis chapter 38, 39 onwards, you'd find that the story of Joseph comes into play. This famine is set up as a period at least more than 7 years after Joseph got into or was sold into Egypt. But the famine was orchestrated by God. Now, David is using this psalm to imply that when this famine happened upon the land, it is not merely Canaan, it is including Egypt. And this would be a very rare famine. Why? Because Egypt has never ever been in famine for a long, long time, for as long as they can remember. But the other places would have famine, because if you have read Genesis chapter 12, for example, Abraham had to go into Egypt. So every time there was a famine, they had to go somewhere. And the most fertile place in that whole area was Egypt because of the River Nile. But here in verse 16, God orchestrated this famine upon the land that included everywhere, including Egypt. And famine is lack of bread. Bread meaning lack of grain. Lack of grain meaning no wheat, no barley, no corn. And so they would have to go down to Egypt to buy these things. Now, it includes that there is also a lack of fruits, but nobody actually keep fruits as food, but grain as food. We also read in verse 17 that God sent a man before them, before Israel, and his name was Joseph, who was sold as a slave. Now, this word, as I had indicated earlier, is avad. It can mean slave, it can mean servant. And so the idea is this person, whether slave or servant, and by way of using this word slave, it would mean bond servant, meaning you are sold into the ownership of another master. So the word avad depends on the context. For example, Israel is a servant of God. Although you may want to use the word slave, in this case, sold as a slave means that he is not a mere servant who is free. He is a servant who is bond, meaning somebody owns him. Where a free servant would be a servant who is given an option to listen to the instructions of a master to obey or not. Whereas a slave would be not given an option, because if a person does not observe or obey, he'll be punished by the master, because the master owns the servant or the slave. So that is how we would understand this word servant. So we're talking now about Joseph. So tell the world about Joseph, because it was God who sent before them before famine ever came into play. Now, all of these is found in chapter 39 of Genesis onwards. Verse 18 says, they forced his feet into shackles, he was put in iron. Now, this word, he was put in iron, this would be nephesh. But more importantly, again, as song goes, this is an A and a B. Into shackles, into irons. The shackles are made of iron, and they force him. And in this case, you find that he forced his feet into shackles, and is about Joseph right here. He was put into iron, and this means that he was incarcerated. After the episode with Potiphar's wife, where he ran out and he was set up to be arrested and cast into prison. Now, Egyptian prison is not the most pleasant of places, but here it is told to us in this song that David is singing, that God sent this man Joseph to be sold as a slave into Egypt, and we know it as Potiphar's slave. And after the episode with Potiphar's wife, they forced Joseph into shackles and put him into iron. And so this basically says Joseph and his nephesh, his entire being, is being persecuted and oppressed and made lowly in prison. Now, this whole song, as being played out and sung by David, is first painting a very, very lowly and bleak picture that before the famine came that God orchestrated, there was this man, Joseph, and he didn't have a good beginning in Egypt. We're now told in verse 19, until the time that his word came to pass, the word of the Lord refined him. Now, the Hebrew gives us a little bit more insight. Until the time that God's word came to pass. And this has to do with the interpretation of dreams. There were two dreams that he had to interpret when he was in prison, but the third dream, of which the Pharaoh had, became more important, because that one put Joseph up into the number 2 position in Egypt. It was during this time that he was forgotten in the prison that he had refinement. So the utterance of God, the declaration of God, purified him. And so the period in the prison is spoken as a time where his soul or his life was refined and purified. That would be the way to understand. And so this is to paint a picture that amidst all the problems, God is seen as a hidden hand behind the events to bring about the salvation of the Hebrew people in the descendants of Jacob. Verse 20, the king sent and released him, the ruler of peoples and set him free. So understand that again, this is an A and a B. In Psalms, there is very often two parts of the statement, and both parts speak about the same thing, emphasizing on the imagery that you're about to see. The king is Pharaoh. The ruler of the peoples is Pharaoh. The idea of releasing him is to set him free. And so you find that it is about the fact that the Pharaoh himself freed Joseph. And so this gives that picture in the hymn, in the psalm, that this is a supernatural event. The hand of God was behind. And so to tell the peoples what God has done. So the Ark of the Covenant being moved into Jerusalem led to David recalling all the major events that led to the kingdom being set up. Now, in verse 21, I would like to point out to you something very interesting. This relates a lot to David. He is now the king of all Israel, both the northern tribes and also the southern tribes, Judah. So as king of all Israel, he ruled from Jerusalem. And now he is finding the dream of his life to be able to usher in the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem to a temporary tent to house the Ark of the Covenant. And he pens this psalm, and really bless God and praise God and thank God. That was how God's faithfulness can be seen because of the covenant that was made to Abraham, how God behind the scenes engineered the rescue and the movement of the descendants of Jacob into Egypt. And why? You see, all of these things, when you look at history and the book of Genesis, there needs to explain a reason why did they have to go into a land that did not belong to them. Because way back in Genesis chapter 15, God already told Abraham, your descendants will be strangers in a land that does not belong to them. And after 400 years, they will return to this place where you are standing. And so to make the descendants of Israel or the descendants of Jacob to be in a strange land would be to find a way to move them there, and the way of moving them is very much a famine, but also how Joseph had to be raised up to a place of power. So let's take a look at the book of Genesis. I draw your attention here. In verse 21 of Psalm 105 says, he made him lord over his house, the Pharaoh's house, and a ruler over all his possessions. We need to understand what really did happen, because this word lord over the house is Adon. Lord means the chief of his house, and this would be the Pharaoh's house. And over all his possessions will be across the land. Now, if you remember, in Genesis chapter 41, which we have here on the screen, now it happened at the end of 2 full years that the Pharaoh had a dream. He was standing by the Nile, and behold, the Nile had 7 cows came up looking fat looking and fine looking and fat, and they grazed in the marsh grass. Then 7 other cows came up after them from the Nile, ugly and thin, and they stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. The ugly and thin cows ate the 7 fine-looking fat cows, and Pharaoh woke up. But he fell asleep again and dreamed a second time, and behold, 7 ears of grain came up on a single stalk, plump and good. Then behold, 7 ears, thin and scorched by the east wind. And understand, the east wind is a hot wind that comes from the desert. sprouted up after them, and the thin ears swallowed the 7 plump and full ears, and Pharaoh awoke, and it was a dream. Now, long story short is that he was troubled and he called for everyone to interpret the dream. And then they remembered that there was somebody who had an ability to interpret dream, and this was a Hebrew youth in verse 12, and he could interpret dreams and understand the ability to interpret dreams really come from God. And so Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he came, and Pharaoh said to Joseph, and so we can read this a little bit. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream, but no one can interpret it. And I've heard it said about you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Joseph then answered Pharaoh, saying, it has nothing to do with me. God will give Pharaoh an answer for his own good. Now, this is important because Joseph is reiterating verse 19. It is a test. Because Joseph was able to interpret dreams, Joseph never lauded himself, never claimed that he had the ability. He always said it was God who will give Pharaoh an answer. It has nothing to do with me. I don't have any ability to tell you. It is God who will tell you. Now, this in itself is God's refinement of Joseph. He understood his relationship with God, who God is. David is recounting this because David knows who God is. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, in my dream, there I was standing on the bank of the Nile. 7 cows, fat, good looking, came out of the Nile, grazed on the marsh grass. Then behold, 7 of the cows came up, and then he merely told Joseph what that meant. Both the dreams. And finally, Joseph said this. And Joseph said to Pharaoh, Pharaoh's dreams are one. Both dreams say the same thing. Just like what we have in the book of Psalms that we have said, every verse that you see in most cases, it is broken down into 2 halves. Both halves are saying the same thing. And so in this case, it is a poetic way of telling Pharaoh 2 dreams, but both dreams say the same thing. And God has told Pharaoh what he is about to do, what God is about to do. That 7 good cows are 7 years, and 7 ears are 7 years, and the dreams are one and the same. The 7 thin and ugly cows came after them are 7 years, and 7 thin ears scorched by the east wind also will be 7 years of famine. And as I have spoken to Pharaoh, God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. Now, this ability to interpret a dream came from God. And so we're not told how God spoke to Joseph, but Joseph explained 7 years of abundance coming in the land of Egypt, not in the land of Canaan. Then 7 years of famine will come. All will be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and famine will ravage the land, including the land of Egypt and everywhere else. And so the abundance will be unknown in the land because of the subsequent famine will be very severe. And so what about the repeating of the dream twice? That the matter is confirmed by God. And I want to draw your attention to this. It is confirmed by God because it was spoken twice, and God will quickly bring it about. When we read in the Psalms 2 halves, and both times it says the same thing, it is an affirmation of what we are about to read. Now, long story short, Pharaoh looked for a man to do this, and he was saying, how can he find somebody like that? Verse 38 speaks about this. Can we find a man who has this really wise character? And so Pharaoh said, since God has informed you all of this, and Pharaoh now understand it's not Joseph who has the ability, it was God. And there's no one as discerning and wise as you are, then you shall be in charge of my house. And all my people shall be obedient to you. Only regarding the throne, I will be greater than you. And so, what this really means is this: on the throne, Joseph is number two. In the house, all my people, he is number one. And so, the claim here is very simple: I have placed you over all the land of Egypt, over all his possessions, Lord of his house. Now, I just wanted you to see this purely because much of what is read in the Psalms require a good background, because David knew. Now, if you had never read Genesis 41, you will never know what this means. Why would Pharaoh do that? I would urge you that storytelling is not good enough. I think it's important for all of us to actually look at the text itself. And so we have just briefly seen this, and Pharaoh making him Lord over his house and over all his possession is really found in these two verses. Joseph is really number two after Pharaoh, as powerful in the land, and he was not even an Egyptian. We continue in verse 22. And to imprison his high officials at will, that he might teach his elders wisdom. I think we need to understand this. To imprison his high officials, this word here is Sari, the SARS, his princes. His princes refers to his brothers, that he might teach his elders, his older brothers. Both of these speaks about chapter 42 and 43, that he had to deal with the brothers coming to Egypt to buy wheat, and he wanted to see Benjamin. And so there were two times that they had to come to Egypt from chapters 42, 43, and 44. Then you will find that eventually even Jacob came to Egypt. But in verse 22, because it's translated as high officials, this is an implication to the princes of Israel, and that would be Jacob. Now, when you talk about princes, you would find that this is very similar to the way that you explain in, say, ancient Chinese culture. When you have a very rich man, his sons are called princes. His daughters are called princesses. The reason why this is done is because Eastern culture notes that the rich, powerful person is like a king, and the sons are affectionately called prince, the daughter, princess. And same thing in the Hebrew culture, Jacob's sons are called princes, and Jacob's daughter is a princess. Now, that is the meaning of the high officials. It's princes. The second one is elders. And by elders, you find that Joseph is the youngest among all his brothers, other than Benjamin, the youngest of all. And it is to teach them wisdom. Now, this is the word here. Teach them how to be wise. Teach them to see why things happen the way it did. Now, Joseph is now wiser. He has spent time away from the family, has gone through refinement in Egypt, in the prisons, and now elevated to number 2 in the land. And he understands why he is placed there, and he attributes this to God. And so David sees that and puts it into the song. In verse 23, Israel also came into Egypt, so Jacob lived in the land of Ham. Now again, this is an A and a B. That Egypt is the land of Ham. Now the land of Ham covers Egypt into Canaan, into all those areas, right? And definitely Egypt is the land of Ham, and even east and west and south of Egypt are all called land of Ham. Israel is Jacob, and hence we have an A and a B. While Joseph was trying to teach the brothers, eventually Jacob came into Egypt, and we were told the number of people coming in, and Jacob died in Egypt. And that would be the final chapters of the book of Genesis. That's the recollection. And by putting it into the song, David wants all peoples to know these stories because it is God's hand to lead them into Egypt. Now, in 24, we're now told that he made his people very fruitful and made them stronger than his enemies or those who are hostile to them. So understand that very fruitful means increase in number. Stronger is increase in strength. That their enemies, this would be the Egyptians. Not really enemies, but those who are hostile to them. It must be understood that, as David understands, God brought Jacob or Israel and his family into Egypt and grew them by number, grew them by strength. And in this case, we can now tell that God is building a nation. He is not just having a number of families there, but building a nation, because a nation is understood by numbers and power. Why in Egypt is because while they were in Egypt, they were well protected by all other enemies. And so if you think of it, David sees this as God's hand, as well as Joseph sees that as well in Genesis chapter 50. But it's God's hand that led them to Egypt, thereby fulfilling Genesis chapter 15, as God has said, that they will all be in a strange land, the land where they don't own, both Canaan and Egypt, and in this case, very much Egypt, to spend the time there to grow into a large number. And when they left Egypt, they became a nation. Verse 25 says this: He turned their hearts to hate his people, to deal cunningly with his servants. Now, 25 says, to deal cunningly with his servants. as well as turn their heart to hate his people. It is to look at his people, Israel, his servants, Israel, and their hearts would be the Egyptians. And this would be in Exodus chapter 1, where a Pharaoh came up and did not know Joseph. And as they were fearful of the increase in number of the Hebrew people, they became stronger. They began to hate. Now, hate means to turn away. They don't want to mingle with Israel because there were just too many of them. Deal cunningly would be to plot to subjugate these people. Verse 26, God sent. So you notice this whole psalm is about David proclaiming the deeds of God so that we can know God, his character, his power. So he sent his servant Moses, not his slave, but his servant, one who listens to what he tells them. It's like when you go into a coffee shop and you place an order with the order taker, the waiter. The waiter is, in fact, understood in this context as a servant, because when you place an order, he will go and fetch your order. Now, you want to have coffee or tea, and he will bring that. And so that, in its sense, is a servant. Now, you don't own that person. That person does it because it was his job, not because he had to listen to you that you owned him. So that's why it is treated in the English term as servant as opposed to slave. But in the Hebrew word is very much the same. Aaron, whom he had chosen. So God chose Aaron amongst all the people because he came from the tribe of Levi. And no, even though he had done wrong at the episode of the golden calf, but the Levites stood on God's side. And so Aaron became the one that God had chosen. So it's about God. Everything in this psalm is about God. And we will end with verse 27. They performed his wondrous acts among them and miracles in the land of Ham. So let us end by understanding the text. They, in verse 27, would be Moses and Aaron. They. And in 27, it says they perform, but this was not really performed. They placed. They placed, I guess we should retranslate this. They placed among them, the words of his signs. I think that would be a good way of saying. So instead of he performed his wondrous act, it should be they placed among them the words of his signs. Now, who is them? Them would be the Egyptians. And miracles, this miracle is wonders. And wonders are also seen as signs as well. Something miraculous in the land of Ham. So understand this is Egypt. Them would be Egyptians. Now, occasionally, the English will find it a bit difficult to understand, mainly because the translation from the Hebrew occasionally becomes a bit problematic. But nevertheless, when you understand the proper Hebrew, you find that the expressions is actually very straightforward. Moses and Aaron were the ones who conducted everything God told them so that the words are performed as signs. Signs means it's visible. So everything we're talking about here, supernatural acts, the miracles, the signs, the wonders, they are all public. They are all national, either against Egypt and the Egyptians, or that the Israelites can see for themselves, and they are never, ever described as a personal event. Why? Because these are all lessons for all peoples. They must be testified and evidence because people would have seen it. Not a private matter where two or three persons actually saw it or nobody saw it at all. Those will not be considered signs in the Hebrew. And so David used these, and these are all common terminology from the Hebrew language. So I'm trying to spend a little bit more time trying to expose all of us to the underlying Hebrew so that you would see that this very much deals with what God did with the Israelites and how all these wonders and signs and supernatural acts of God being made public can be then expressed to all peoples. And Psalm 105 really is David's expression of praise and thanksgiving to who God is, to be able to protect the people, guide the people, faithful to the people, the hidden hand behind the history of the people until this point in time where he could roll in the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem, which is the background of Psalm 105. And with this, we come to the end of our session, and we will continue the next part tomorrow.